Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8. I want you to read this sentence slowly, because most people read past it without understanding what it actually says. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. He, Jesus, the eternal Son of God, the one through whom all things were created, omniscient before the foundation of the world, and he learned something through suffering, not theoretically understood it, not knew about it from a distance. The Greek word there is emethen experiential acquisition, genuine learning that came from going through something, not observing it from the outside. Before the Incarnation, the Son of God had never obeyed in hunger, had never obeyed through betrayal, had never obeyed while being mocked, flogged, and nailed to wood. He was always perfectly obedient, that's not in question. But obedience demonstrated under those specific conditions, that was learned through what he suffered. Now here is the question that should stop every person who has ever asked, why is God allowing this? If the Son of God, perfect, eternal, all-knowing, could not access a particular kind of formation without going through pain, what makes us think we can? Pain is not a defect in God's design. It is not an oversight, not a malfunction, not evidence that the system broke down. According to the text, it is one of the primary mechanisms of the design. The question is not why God allows pain. The question is what pain is specifically designed to produce, because the Bible tells us exactly what that is, and it is something no other experience can replicate. Before we go through what pain produces, I need to establish the principle that holds everything else together. Pain in the Bible is never presented as the goal. It is always presented as the mechanism. That distinction matters more than most people realize. When people say God uses pain, they sometimes mean it in a passive sense, as though God is working around a problem that shouldn't have been there in the first place. But the New Testament language is not passive. Romans 5:3 does not say tribulation can lead to something good if you respond well. It says tribulation produces, the Greek word is katergazomai, meaning to work fully, to accomplish, to fashion, to bring about a specific result through a deliberate process. Paul is describing pain as a mechanism with a specific output, not a random input that God occasionally redeems, a designed mechanism with a predictable chain of production. And James, writing independently of Paul, uses the same framework. He calls it the dokimion of your faith, the testing instrument, the proving apparatus that produces steadfastness. Same Greek root as dokim in Romans 5, the word used in ancient metallurgy for placing metal in a furnace to burn away everything impure and reveal what is genuine underneath. 2 writers, 2 books. Same mechanism described with the same metallurgical language. The consistency is not accidental. So what does this mechanism produce? The Bible is specific. It is not vague about the output. And when you understand the output, you understand why no shortcut to it exists. The first thing pain produces is perseverance. And perseverance is the one thing that cannot be simulated. Romans 5:3. Tribulation produces perseverance. The Greek word is hupomone, sometimes translated patience, but the word has more weight than that. Hupomone literally means to remain under, not to escape the weight, not to find a way around it, to stay under it and keep moving. It is the quality of a soldier who keeps his post when it would be easier to abandon it, the quality of an athlete who keeps running when his body is telling him to stop. You cannot develop hupomone in the absence of something to remain under. By definition, it requires weight. It requires something pressing down on you that you have chosen or been called to keep moving beneath. Here is what this means practically. You cannot acquire genuine perseverance in a classroom. You cannot watch a sermon about it, feel inspired, and walk away having it. You cannot decide to have it in a moment of clarity. It is built by doing one thing, remaining under difficulty, and it is only built there. This is why Jesus, in Gethsemane, sweat blood and prayed 3 times, that the cup would be taken away. He knew what was coming. The divine Son of God, who had never been separated from the Father, was about to bear the weight of the sin of the world. And the text says he prayed so intensely that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. He stayed, he prayed, he remained under it, and in doing so demonstrated the hupomone that the writer of Hebrews says he learned through what he suffered. The perseverance in your story right now, the fact that you are still here, still believing, still moving forward under something that is heavy, that is not nothing, that is a substance being built in you that does not exist in the people who have not carried what you are carrying. And it cannot be given to you by any other means. The second thing pain produces is character. But not just any character. Proven character, which is a different thing entirely. Paul writes in Romans 5-4 that perseverance produces dokim, proven character. And the word dokim is one of the most precise words in the Greek language. In the ancient world, dokim was the word used when a metalsmith placed metal in a furnace at high heat. The fire burned away the dross, the impurities, the alloys, the things that had no business being in pure metal. What remained after the fire was dokimos genuine, tested and approved. The metal that came out of the furnace was more valuable than when it went in, not because the fire added something, but because the fire removed everything that was false. Paul uses this exact word to describe what suffering produces in a human soul. The heat of tribulation burns away what is pretend. What is left, the faith that remains, the love that remains, the trust that remains, is dokimos, genuine, tested, real. Here is why this matters. The world is full of people whose character has never been tested. They believe, they are generous, they've never had to choose between their comfort and someone else's need. They believe they are patient, they've never been in a situation that threatened to break them. They believe they are faithful, their faith has never cost them anything. And none of that is dishonesty. It is simply untested. But a person who has been through the fire, who has been pressed, crushed, held under, and has come out the other side, still trusting God, still loving people, still obeying, and that is dokim. That is character that has been tested and approved. It is worth something that untested character is not, in the same way that refined gold is worth more than unrefined ore. Peter, writing from experience, makes the same argument. 1 Peter 1:7. The tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, that perishes though it is tested by fire, more precious than gold, not despite the fire, because of it. Job is the Old Testament version of this truth. At the beginning of his story, God says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright." That was God's assessment of Job before the suffering. And then, after everything, the losses, the grief, the ash heap, the theological arguments with friends who got it wrong after all of it, Job said, "When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold." He was right. The man who emerged from the suffering was not the same man who entered it. The character was the same in kind, but different in depth. Tested, proven, real in a way it had not been before. The third thing pain produces is the most surprising and the most permanent. Romans 5-4-5. Proven character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Hope, but not the fragile kind, not the kind that depends on circumstances cooperating, the kind that has been stress-tested at every point and has not collapsed. Here is the distinction Paul is drawing. There are two kinds of hope in the world. One is built on optimism, a feeling that things will probably work out, a confident expectation based on nothing in particular. That kind of hope puts people to shame because eventually circumstances come along that those feelings cannot survive. You hoped for something. It didn't happen. and the hope you had built your life on turned out to be unstable. But the hope produced by the sequence Paul describes, tribulation, perseverance, proven character, is a completely different structure. It is built not on feelings, but on evidence, on a track record, on the experience of having gone through fire and found God faithful on the other side of it. This is why Paul can write Philippians 4:11 from a prison cell. I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. Learned. Same Greek root as Hebrews 5:8. Learned through experience. Paul's contentment was not a personality trait. It was not a spiritual gift. It was the product of having been through enough hard things, beatings, shipwrecks, imprisonments, hunger, and finding God sufficient in each one. The contentment was evidence of the sequence. Tribulation had produced perseverance. Perseverance had produced proven character, and proven character had produced a hope so solid that a prison cell could not destabilize it. That kind of hope is not available at the beginning of the sequence. You cannot have Paul's contentment without Paul's suffering, not because God is withholding it, but because it is structurally produced by going through the earlier steps. James says it explicitly. Let steadfastness have its full effect. The full effect takes time. The full effect requires the earlier steps to run their course. And the end point James names is one of the most stunning phrases in the entire New Testament: perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The Greek word teleos, brought to its intended completion, holokleros, entirely whole, lacking in nothing. That is the destination of the sequence. Not just hope, wholeness. A person who has been through the mechanism and come out the other side complete, lacking in nothing. Not because they had everything, but because they had been through enough to prove that the one thing they had was sufficient. I want to come back to Hebrews 5-8, because there is something in it that most people have never noticed. The verse does not say Jesus learned obedience despite what he suffered. It says he learned it through what he suffered. The suffering was not an obstacle to the learning. It was the medium of it. There is also something remarkable in the original Greek that doesn't survive translation. The words for learned and suffered, emethen and epithen, rhyme in Greek. The writer of Hebrews constructed this sentence deliberately, so that the sound of suffered and the sound of learned echo each other, as if to say, these two things belong together so completely that they even sound the same. Before the Incarnation, the Son of God had eternal knowledge of what obedience meant. He had watched it, knew its definition, had always been perfectly obedient in his divine nature, but he had never obeyed in the body of a human being at the end of a whip, had never submitted to the Father's will when every nerve ending in a mortal frame was screaming in protest, had never surrendered in a garden while sweat fell like blood to the ground, asking 3 times for another way and choosing to go forward anyway. That obedience demonstrated in a human body under those specific conditions required going through those specific conditions. It could not be accessed theoretically. It could not be learned from a distance. It required emethen through epathen, learning through suffering. If that is true of Jesus, and the text says it is, then it is certainly true of us. There are things about trust, obedience, and dependence on God that cannot be obtained by reading about them, hearing about them, or watching someone else go through them. They are obtained by going through them yourself. This is not cruelty. This is the same logic that makes a medical student complete a residency before they operate independently. The knowledge of surgery can be taught in a classroom. The wisdom of it can only come from standing at a table with a scalpel in your hand and someone's life depending on your next decision. No shortcut produces the same result. I want to be careful here, because this framework can be misused in ways that cause real damage. Pain does not automatically produce what I have described. Tribulation can produce perseverance, but it can also produce bitterness, if the person going through it turns away from God rather than toward Him. The furnace is the same. The output depends on what is inside it and what it is oriented toward. You can go through enormous suffering and come out the other side, harder, more closed, more defended, more certain that God cannot be trusted. That is also a product of pain, just not the one Paul is describing. The difference in Paul's sequence is the phrase that opens it in verse 3, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance.